You were here. We were here.
Does this sound okay? Loud enough? All right. Well, hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Poison Pen and everybody on Facebook. It is a real treat to have two of my absolute favorite writers. To my immediate left here is Wallace Stroby, who has just a kick-ass new book called Some Die Nameless. We'll be talking about that. And then Joe Ide is here for his third book, amazing book in the IQ series. How many of you have read books 1 and 2? All right. You got a good crowd. And so I figured, as usual, I'd kind of have each of you guys maybe tell us a little bit about the new book. Joe, maybe in context of the first 2 books, like where we left off at the end of Righteous, and how it picks up in Wrecked. And then Wallace, I'd have you tell a little bit about Some Die Nameless. And then I'll pitch some questions, and then open it up to you guys for some questions that you might have. So, Joe, you want to start us off?
Don't get witty ending excited. I'm not quite there yet. I don't have anything to say.
Great.
You guys already read it. You'll be fine. You're okay.
Wrecked is in a way a continuation of Righteous in terms of the characters. It was always my plan to sort of have them grow from book to book, and so Isaiah has moved on, and Dodson has a baby, and so things are sort of progressing in their lives. The bad guys in the piece are 5 CIA guys who were at Abu Ghraib. I wanted to give them a little special viciousness. And the characters from the previous books are back. Dodson and Duranga, neighborhood. The story revolves around a young woman he met in Righteous, Grace. He was very intrigued. She wanted nothing to do with him. But in Wrecked, she comes to him as a client. And so he's a little smug about that. And she wants to find her mother. Her mother disappeared 10 years ago without a trace. And then one day Grace sees her, catch a glimpse of her across the street. And what's my mom doing here? And she doesn't know it, but these Abu Ghraib guys are after her. And Sarah, her name, she has photos from Abu Ghraib of the bad guys doing even more terrible things. And so there's this race. Who's going to find Sarah first? And that's the short version of the story.
Mm-hmm. But Isaiah and Dodson have kind of gone into business together, right? They're partners now, and talk a little bit about how that works out.
They're a fractious pair anyway. And so the whole idea of a partnership it seemed like a good idea. But they're always jockeying for control. Whatever they're talking about, there's always this underlying current of who's in charge. And that continues and causes some problems.
Yeah, Dodson, has the idea that, IQ, he takes a lot of his payment in, a lot of unorthodox ways, stuff. Yeah, a reindeer sweater, food, whatever they can afford. He's kind of like, IQ's sort of the people's detective in a way. And so Dodson says, that's all well and good, but how about a little bit of, money every now and again? So he tries to come in and clean up his finances.
Dodson is an ex-hustler, and money is very important to him. And, he's supposed to bring in big clients into this partnership. And it just apparent right away that Dodson doesn't know about money. I mean, he knows how to collect bills, and lots of people owe Isaiah money. He doesn't keep track. He figures they will pay him sooner or later. He's just that way. And Dodson is a complete opposite. Pay me my money. He goes to their houses, he knocks on their doors, he harasses them, but he's very effective. He's very effective in that role. Problems turn out later, but it starts off okay.
This is, as those of you who've read the books, that the dialogue is always just spot on and very, very funny. I mean, there were parts in this book where I was just laughing out loud and reading them. I'm tempted to ask you to read a part of it, but would you like to do that? Sure. All right. I get to pick the part that's...
By the way, one of Joe's biggest fans, in more ways than one, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Oh.
Right. He has a blurb on the last book.
You have no idea what it's like to shake hands with a guy 7'2". My hand just disappeared.
And he's a big Sherlockian. He's a big enthusiast. He's written a couple books himself now.
He's a huge Sherlock fan.
Yeah.
Huge. And he's writing a Mycroft series, which is good. Which is good. He's right. You sort of wouldn't expect that. You know, I knew he's a very erudite man. Oh, he is this. He's really widely read, and really, he collects Persian rugs, and he has this huge jazz collection. He's a many and varied guy. Very shy. Very shy. I guess if you've been gawked at for 40 years, you get a little shy.
Did you meet him just through him being a admirer of your book?
I got introduced to him through a publicist
Okay.
that we both knew.
Do you think this bit where he talks about the baby troubles he's having?
Oh, sure.
Love this.
Okay. So, in Righteous, Dodson was about to have a baby with his girlfriend named Charisse, and in Wrecked, the baby's here. Those flaming sun, Dodson said. He strolled in like the landlord, an icy breeze with an attitude, condensed of stature but walking large. He gained a few pounds, but was still thin and roped up, immaculate, in a white t-shirt, jeans, and a modest gold chain. So what's up with you? Nothing special. How's Micah? Dodson made a face like he was remembering a car accident. Man, that baby is work. You know he can't do nothing for himself. Can't even hold his oversized head up. You got to watch him all the damn time. You didn't know that going in? Knowing and doing is two different things. You know, Charisse makes me wash my hands every time I pick him up. I don't keep my toothbrush that clean. And the kid is always spitting up and he farts like he's full of propane. I couldn't believe it the first time I changed his diaper. He don't eat nothing but mother's milk, and his shit's the same color as hot dog mustard. And it got birdseed in it. Birdseed, I said. It looks like birdseed, Dodson replied, and for some reason, we always hurrying around and rushing. Why, I couldn't tell you. Damn baby ain't no bigger than a pot roast, and he ain't going nowhere. And everything's a damn crisis. The boy gets a rash on his ass, and Charisse and her mama carry on like he had a tumor on his neck. I said, well, what are y'all worried about? Everybody gets a rash on their ass at one time or another. I got a rash on my ass right now. How'd that go over, Isaiah said. Like I farted at a funeral. And Charisse done lost her sense of humor altogether. Other night, I was changing the boy's diaper, trying to keep it light, you know how I do. I said, Charisse, check this out. The baby's got a heart on it. He takes after his daddy, too. Girl didn't crack a smile. And her mama looked at me like I was crip walking on her grave. And check this. I got to use my inside voice. The fuck does that mean? I am inside.
That's just a small sample of the delights that I find. Just great stuff. How do you kind of keep an ear to the street and get the voices and the dialogue and the slang? Just listen.
Well, I grew up in South Central, so the voices are already there, and that vernacular, that was my first language. I had to learn to speak like this. So it's maybe the easiest part of the books to write. The challenge is sort of differentiating everyone, you know, making Dodson different from Duranda, different from Isaiah, but still stay within, you know, the confines of the neighborhood. voices are easy. Voices are easy.
Well, Wallace, let's talk a little bit about your new book, Some Die Nameless. Terrific book. It's a standalone. Some of you might know his Chris Stone series of books, really wonderful books. But this is a terrific read. Kind of reminded me,
thank you.
there's like a little element of gold medal in here.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a retro throwback thing I was going for. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Ray Devlin and the basic setup for the book.
Well, I had written 4 books about Krista Stone, who was a female professional thief, and I wanted something. I wanted to expand the scope of the book a little bit and give it some sort of an international connection. And I'm sure this is the case with Joe as well. The stuff that's been happening in the news, like the last 5 to 10 years, it has to find its way into fiction, crime fiction. And so there was a certain amount of that, which I got into as well, in terms of military contractors and this whole culture which has sprung up since 9/11 and since the Iraq War, where there's just this whole strata of people who are professional soldiers, but are not beholden to any government or answerable. So there was that I wanted to write about as well. And so I made Ray Devlin a guy in his 50s who had been in the early stages of professional paid soldiers. Not so much mercenary, because mercenary is somebody that gets paid to fight for another country. In Ray's case, and with a lot of these contractors, they get paid by an American company, and then they go fight somewhere else. But so they're not strictly mercenaries, but I wanted him to have been part of a team that was involved in stuff, although he was not special ops, as he says. He was just a grunt teaching basic military tactics to indigenous populations. And at the same time, I wanted to write for the first time about newspapers, because I spent 23 years in the newspaper business and watched it, the brutal attrition of the last few years at a time when they're needed most. And so I wanted to write the second half of the book, or actually, alternating with a young female reporter, Tracy Quinn, who's struggling to hold on to her job, and at the same time picks up a little piece of this puzzle that Devlin also has a piece of, that gets initiated by a murder in Philadelphia. And so I wanted these two people from these disparate worlds coming together, and each of them having a piece of the puzzle, and then having to actually to get, to share those with each other before they could find out what was going on in a way that would put both of them eventually in jeopardy.
Well, it's funny. There's so much going on in the book. There's we learn a lot about. It reflects kind of our somewhat questionable history in these agencies of propping up corrupt dictators and then taking them down. And there's a little bit about in the background of the book about that.
Yeah, it's funny because there's a backstory in the book about Devlin's backstory takes place in South America, and I wanted a country like Venezuela, but I didn't want it to be Venezuela because I wanted to be able to do whatever I wanted with it. So I invented a country next to Venezuela called San Marcos, which I could do all that with. And so American involvement in Central and South America goes back to the 1800s with William Walker in Nicaragua, and so we have a rich and not so great history in South America and Central America. But I had originally set his backstory in the Balkans in the 1990s, the early 1990s, because I became fascinated by the Serbs and the Croats and what happened and how this civilized European society collapsed into barbarity in the space of a very short period of time. Once Tito died and the Soviet Union fell and Yugoslavia split up into all these factions and all these tribal conflicts. So I did an enormous amount of really depressing research about Croatia and Serbia in the 1990s. And then as I was working on the book, after there was a first draft, I was working on the book with my editor, Josh Kendall, who Joe and I share at Mulholland Books. And he and his co-editor, they weren't so crazy about the Croatia stuff. They thought, it was barely on our radar in the United States back in 1990, and that nobody remembers it now. So he asked me to think of some possible ways to switch that out. And eventually I thought about, South America, and then it all clicked, because then, what's going on there in Venezuela now, so all that came together. So I took all the Croatian stuff out and relayed the book with the backstory of South America. And then a couple weeks after that, I had lunch with my British publisher. And it's the first time I'd met her. And because the book is also out from Mulholland, UK. And she was saying, what I really liked about the book, I really liked all that Croatia stuff. I said, oh yeah? Because it's all gone. And she said that in England, they were very aware of it, because she said all of a sudden there were all these refugee kids in her high school, with these terrible stories. So they were all, it was very much, they were very aware of it in England at that time, in a way that we really weren't here. So I couldn't argue with it. And then once I was able to do the backstory of South America, it actually made a lot more sense. So it seems like it was almost fated to come out that way.
Well, Devlin's he's almost like an old school hero. I mean, he has a military background, but he's not super skilled. I mean, he wasn't an elite fighter. He has skills. I mean, he does, but he's not Jason Bourne. And when he gets hurt, he stays hurt.
Well, he's 54 now.
Yeah, I wanted him to be in his mid-50s, and he was never a special ops guy. As he says to his son when he's having a conversation with his estranged son, he says, "I was never special anything." And so I wanted him to be, hey, I'm in my mid-50s, and when he does have a fight in the beginning of it, he's losing for the majority of the fight, and then when he does finally get the upper hand, he throws up, because the amount of stress to your body between the adrenaline and just the physical wounds. And so I wanted him to be somebody who was also, he had skills, or he wouldn't have been in this business, and he wouldn't be able to carry the story forward if he didn't. But at the same time, I wanted him to be vulnerable. I didn't want him to be a Jason Bourne. Well, I love those books and those movies, but I wanted it to be a little more realistic.
Right. So in the beginning of the book, he's attempted to be off the grid, relocated down to the Florida area, and the challenges of being off the grid these days for a writer with the technology, and anybody who owns a cell phone is immediately findable, right?
Yeah, it's always tough and also trying to put people in jeopardy in a world where everybody is 2 seconds away from everybody else,
right?
No matter where you are. So yeah, that was a little, so that he had to be really retro. He doesn't have a computer, he doesn't watch news. He really had to be off the grid, and so part of it was his sort of coming back in the connection, reconnecting with other people in the form of this younger reporter. But it was very important to me that they not hook up at any point.
Right.
Because the Hollywood thing, you see these actors in their 50s and 60s, and these actresses in their 20s and 30s having romantic relationships. I didn't want to do that. I wanted there to be a clear,
That was
age
really refreshing,
differentiation.
actually.
I didn't want them to hook up. I wanted them to respect each other. But I didn't want to have to force that in any sort of romantic thing, or put her in, undue jeopardy so that he can save her. So in the one scene in the book where she is in severe jeopardy, she saves herself.
Can you talk a little bit about, Tracy Quinn, this journalist, is a really, really well-done character, and there's a lot in the book about this tension, about, you said, the collapsing world of newspaper reporting, and this sort of click culture, and everything's compressed, and we were talking yesterday about just about newspapers. More and more of it is on the wire stories in all of our papers. What was your experience like? Does that kind of reflect?
Well, I was in the business for 23 years, and I saw, I started, I was 24 years old when I started my first job. I was actually still in college when I got hired full-time in a newspaper. So that was the only job I knew up until I left the paper in 2010. So I saw, I was the last generation to see the way newspapers were, I think, and you know, the collapse of them. My paper, the Star Ledger, which was the largest paper in New Jersey, and Tony Soprano's hometown paper. If you ever watch Sopranos in the newspaper, he always picks up the driveway. It was the Star Ledger, and they would do mock Star Ledger front pages with the characters. We'd given them permission to do that. So I saw, we were offered buyouts in 2010. This has happened in a lot of businesses, but it really hit the newspaper industry. And half of the newsroom took a buyout at the same time, and so the paper was almost gutted right there. I walked out the office on December 31st, 2008, and 60 other people left that same
Sorry,
day.
excuse me. Mom won't leave me alone.
So it was brutal to watch. I still have a lot of friends in the business, and I see what's happened to them. A good friend of mine just got laid off last week after 20 years in the business. So I wanted to reflect that in the book as well. You couldn't write about a reporter and not reflect that.
Do you see it turning around at all?
No.
No.
Speaking of, it's related to Tracy, but the Chrissy Stone books were 4 of them,
Yeah.
all right? And they're all written from a woman's point of view.
Yes.
And just, where did you get the nerves to do that?
Well, I had written my third novel, was a standalone called Gone to November, and that was about a female sheriff's deputy in a rural Florida town who was the only female deputy on the force. And the book was alternating between her and a black hitman from New York who goes down to Florida to recover some money. And at that time when I wrote that, my agent, my editor, and my first reader were all single moms, as was the character, and as is Chrissa Stone in the fourth. So they vetted everything, and there was a lot of stuff. They found a lot of stuff that almost counterintuitive, things that I had done to move the plot forward that a woman might not necessarily have done. At the same time, I wanted to write about women in those situations. Just because a woman will do things differently. She'll make alliances, she'll have relationships, she'll refrain from violence unless it was absolutely necessary. So I wanted to get away from the lone wolf male, almost cliche crime fiction character. And a way to do that was to write about women, but at the same time it had to pass muster, with
That's
with
the
my
one thing you
three
read
readers.
in your reviews. All the reviewers say, this guy really gets women.
No, not really.
No, not really. A mystery. Well, Joe, tell us a little bit about, Isaiah, as we know, he's gone on quite a journey, and he has a story, a backstory that you've kind of parceled out to us in bits and pieces. And now he's 26 in the new book?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
He's 26.
How do you see him developing from here?
Yeah, that's a question.
Because I don't want to
You're
get
asking me
too
about
many
the
spoilers
next
away.
book?
I guess so.
I have to be in his shoes. I'm 26 years old. What's happened with Grace happens with Grace, and I have to think about, well, what would he do from here? How would he go on, and what would he do professionally, and just stay in his head and think about it from his point of view. I think empathy is really one of the most important qualities a writer can have. To be able to put yourself in someone's head and see the world through their eyes, not to judge, but to understand, how they come to the world. And let's say you come into the den and your husband is lying on the couch watching TV, and the first thing you do is make a judgment. What an incredible slob! How hard is it to wear both slippers? There's really no point wearing a bathrobe if you don't close it in the front. Instead of asking yourself, why is there a vacant look in his eyes? Why is he watching a program he doesn't like? Why is he wearing a bathrobe, at 5:30 in the afternoon? Because it makes sense to him. That's the logical thing for him to be doing, given what he's thinking and feeling. And it's the writer's job to tell you that.
Absolutely, and I think that's important no matter what sex or what race or what age you're writing about, you got to find that common ground. It's got to be internal rather than external. And because if you do that well enough, then the reader will connect with it on the same level. Even writing about villains, you know, I spend a lot of time on my villains, sometimes half a book. And you know, you have to be able to do that. You have to be able to access those emotions and those feelings, even the really negative and dark ones. You know, every villain is the hero of his own story. So you have to sort of be, you know, whoever you're writing about, you have to be in that person. You have to be in that headspace.
I think there's a tendency, particularly in our genre, to define a character by two things. One is expertise. You know, he can pilot a helicopter, and wields a samurai sword. The other is lifestyle. He lives in a penthouse, he drives a Maserati, he lives in a log cabin, he drives an old Jeep. But I don't think that's the essence of character. The essence of character is really the character's emotional life. What are they thinking and feeling as they're doing whatever they're doing? I'm not that interested in, you know, a character throwing somebody off a roof. I could throw somebody off a roof. You know, what's interesting is what that character is thinking and feeling before, during, and after they throw somebody off the roof. And that's what will differentiate that character from every other character that throws people off roofs.
Absolutely. I mean, don't you find that you know that you have to have well, let me ask the audience's question. When you read books, like, what do you remember the plot of your favorite book? You know, I just read James Lee Burke's upcoming book, New Iberia Blues, and it is terrific. You know, and a lot of the criticism of him is that he writes the same book over and over again. You know, but I go back and read it every time because I connect so heavily with those characters, and I couldn't tell you what happened in any particular book. You know.
I'm right in the middle of reading Rubber Show, the previous one.
Yeah,
I have it back in the room. Yeah, it's beautiful writing. I would be hard pressed to tell you what the plot was.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
You know, 300 pages into it, but there's certain writers you go to for plot, and he is not one of them. He is just, you know, one of the most beautiful writers, and beautiful observations on age and mortality, and you know, his book, his second Rubber Show book, Heaven's Prisoners, has the greatest closing paragraph in all of crime fiction, if not all of fiction. Awake like a denied lover for the blue glow of dawn. It's just
Not bad.
it's beautiful, you know, and you can bring your own emotions to it, but it's just a beautiful sentence.
There was one. You know, we always underline, you know, these passages in favorite books, but there was one that you wrote about conspiracy theories, and that plays into your new book, the notion of conspiracy theory. Let me see if I can find it here. Just beautifully put. Yeah. Here's a quote from James Lee Burke's new book. He says, I'll try to say it in Burke's voice. That's a challenge. Sorry, Jim, if you're watching.
Yeah.
The term conspiracy theory. The term conspiracy theory has become a term of contempt, I suspect, because many of the electorate cannot accept that sometimes more evil exists at the top of society than at the bottom. And it breaks it all down, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's great. You know, it was always, and his stuff is also, you know, tied in with people's past. And I think when I realized one of the books that really got me to the point where I thought I want to write a book, and this kind of book I want to write is A Morning for Flamingos, which is just a beautiful book. It's self-contained. It is just everything about it. The villains are great. The writing is beautiful, and you know, sometimes you look at a writer like that and you think, I can't do this. There's no way I can do anything like this. But there's a spirit there that I want to try and find my own way to and capture. And I think, you know, very inspirational. You know,
And aggravating. It's really aggravating.
Yeah, because they make it look effortless, which it isn't, but it looks that way.
Yeah. It's like Elmore Leonard and James Lee Burke. You don't understand how they did it. You know, we write for a living, and you just don't understand how they put those sentences together, how they find those words, how they created those images. It's a mysterious thing, but I think that's one of the things that's so compelling about reading. That mysterious element that a writer brings to it that no one else could bring to it.
Now, Joe, you did a lot of TV work before, right?
I wrote scripts that never got made.
What? Tell us a little bit about your background. What was some of the other things that you did?
The first job I ever had was as a school teacher. I guess in the second week, I discovered that I really didn't like kids. They were noisy and fussy, and this was grades 4 to 6. And they kept asking me questions, you know. And so I lasted, I was a terrible teacher. It was just awful. They liked me, but they didn't learn anything. I lasted a semester. And then what else can you do but flee to graduate school? So I went to graduate school. I got a master's in education because my friends were in the program. After that, I started my PhD, but academia was not for me. That wasn't it. So I left, and I had a series of jobs. I was a middle manager in a big corporation, and I was a human resources guy. I worked as a business consultant. I ran an MGO for indigent women, and I had a bunch of odd jobs when I dropped everything to be a screenwriter. I managed an answering service where all the operators were transgender. You know, it was a time when they were really more outcast than they are now. But on the phone, they could work the phones. You know? And I managed this big apartment complex that was full of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And they spoke very little English. And they would string their laundry across from that side of the courtyard to that side of the courtyard. And they would, if they wanted to share a phone, they'd drill a hole in the wall, put the cord through there. It was, if they couldn't pay the rent, they just changed the locks. So that wasn't a good job for me. And then I decided, well, I always wanted to write, so I decided to write screenplays since it seems easy. It's not. I wrote exactly 12 terrible screenplays, and I had an agent acquaintance, and he would send them back with a note. This sucks. This is so boring. Who would watch this? So, and I wrote 12 really bad ones, and then the 13th one was decent, and it sold to Disney. Then I started to work, and I worked a fair bit. But nothing ever got made for one Hollywood reason for another. I mean, when I started out, I wrote a script that was for Bernie Mac. The studio wanted him. And so I wrote the script specifically for him. Everybody loved it. And then Bernie died. And what is that?
He was great.
It was a sign. Anyway, eventually I just got fed up. There was so much failure associated with writing a screenplay. I couldn't deal, and I quit. Nobody noticed, but I quit, and eventually decided to write a novel, which was a good decision.
Had that manuscript been kicking around for quite a while, the IQ, was that your first book that you wrote, or are there some other?
No, I only had one idea. Sherlock in the Hood was it. That was it. That was my only idea. And it took me 3 years. The first year, well, as soon as I started, I discovered that my long form prose was just awful. It was terrible. It was a shock. I mean, I was making my living as a writer, and you know, the long form narrative prose is totally different. You know, it's like playing hockey and football. I mean, you may be able to play one, but that doesn't mean you'll play the other. So it took me a solid year, to learn how to write clear, decent prose. And then the next 2 years, I got into my own style. But yeah, that was a shock. And when I finished the manuscript, I didn't know anybody in publishing. And I had no idea what I would do with it. And so I gave it out to readers. And I have this cousin. His name is Francis Fukuyama. He is a world-renowned political anthropologist. He wrote a book called The End of History, where he predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, he runs a Center for Democracy at Stanford. He consults with governments. He's on the board at RAND, you know? He's that kind of guy. So I'm thinking, well, I'm gonna send my crime to him. Oh my God. But he's a really sweet guy, so I called him up. I said, will you read my book? He said, sure. And then I didn't hear from him for a long time. And I figured, well, you know, he's on the board at RAND. It's not a surprise. But then he did call me. And he said, I really liked the book. He asked me if I had an agent. And I said, no. I got to go get one. And he said, well, let me introduce you to my agent, who turned out to be a woman named Esther Newberg, who's been head of ICM Partners in New York for 25 years. That was the first person who read the book. I got seriously like it. Seriously like it. That's how it started.
I was wanted to ask you, was the name so important to the series, you know, IQ? Was that there from the very beginning, or did that kind of appear later as you were writing?
The original title was Sherlock Jones.
Sounds like a Walter Mosley novel, doesn't it?
I know. But there was like 11,000 Sherlocks out there,
Yeah.
so I figured no, it's not a good idea. And the title IQ wasn't taken. I was surprised. And so now I had to make up a name where the initials were IQ. So I wanted an old school name like Isaiah, and I wanted an African name, the second name, and I'm looking through African names, and I couldn't find one that started with a Q that sounded right. So I made it up.
It's funny, some of you who've heard him speak here before, I always ask you about Margaret Cho and how, do you mind trotting that out again? It's such a great story. She appears in the first book.
There's this kid named Flacco, and he's disabled, and he has this thing for Margaret Cho, and I wanted him to have a role model, somebody he really admired, but I didn't want it to be a baseball player or something like that. And Margaret Cho's story is really interesting. You know, she grew up in San Francisco in a tough neighborhood, and she was a complete outcast. At school, she was ostracized, and when she told her parents that she wanted to be a comedian, they were incredulous. You know? And but Margaret Cho did her own thing in her own way, and so Flacco, this kid, that's why he glommed onto her. She did her own thing in her own way, and he has this. Isaiah gave him this cutout of Margaret Cho, and he just carries it around with him. You know, and tells people, you know, I'm going to go to her concert. You know, she sent me an email, and that's a story of Margaret Cho. Plus, I think she's really funny.
Has she seen the book and responded?
No, she has not seen. Not that I know of. That I know of.
Well, Wallace, it's funny, this is Mr. Stroby's first trip to Arizona. He's never been out here to the desert.
Indeed, yes.
Although I think he went to Las Vegas, right? That
Yeah,
was the
but
closest.
I never left the hotel, I'm pretty sure.
So yesterday, you know, my wife and I were thinking of, you know, kind of a short little day trip to show him some desert, you know, some pretty desert. And so we decided to drive out to Globe, you know, which is a beautiful drive if you've never made it. And yeah, it was great. And in the car, of course, we were talking, and you were telling me some interesting stories about how you became a writer and some of the things that kind of helped you, teach you along the way.
Yeah, the whole mentor
Yeah, can
issue.
you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I've been very lucky as well, and I think there is always a really strong luck component for most writers. As I was telling was telling Patrick, I was a total screw up in high school and beginning of college. I mean, I was a straight C student. Like, you know, I didn't care much about anything.
We have that in common.
And I'd gone for a year. I graduated high school and I went to college in Long Island for a year. I don't know why. I finished with like 6 credits, and then I quit school.
That's impressive.
And I had to, yeah, it's not easy to finish a year of school with only 6 credits, but I did it. And then I had a series of, I was an overnight security guard, which was a terrible job. I worked at a movie theater. I had just all these endless series of crappy jobs where I was getting older, and there were also people in the job who were older than me, and I just saw myself in them. So I thought, I gotta go back to school. So there was a small liberal arts college in St. Augustine, Florida called Flagler College. And at that point, it was, the total student population was 700. And I knew I wanted to get out of New Jersey. And Florida seemed like a good idea. So I went there again, and they took me because they were just eager to like get the roles, you know, get people to go there, because nobody knew about it at the time. It's tripled in size since. And so I got there, the same screw up that I always was, but I always knew I wanted to write. I always knew in some form I wanted to write because I was always a big reader. So I took a reporting class there with the teacher happened to be, he had run he was the news editor of the Today Show for 20 years. And before that, he had been the Associated Press bureau chief in London right after World War II. And he had retired and moved down to St. Augustine and gotten bored and wanted to teach, so he started teaching this course. And so I took his class just because it was oriented towards writing. And the very first day, he asked us all to write a biography, an autobiography of ourselves, short, something short. And so I wrote mine, and I was telling this to Patrick too, this shows what a screw up I was. I wrote mine on one of those little spiral notebooks, like the little ones, the little pocket ones. So I wrote it, you know, really carelessly, and ripped it out of the book, and then paper clipped like 3 pages together and handed that in. And then, I didn't really care. And then the next day we got him. He handed him back. He handed me mine, and I looked at it, and he had written across the front of it, "He writes!" exclamation point.
Wow.
And that was it. And that teacher was also responsible for getting me into Rutgers University. So I left Flagler after a year and a half and I went to Rutgers as a journalism major, and got hired by a newspaper before I graduated. And I was actually in fear because they assumed I had graduated. I didn't tell them I had, but I had the opportunity to work full-time in a newspaper. So I put college on hold, so I was worried that they were going to find out I hadn't actually graduated. So I worked for a year without having graduated college, full-time as a reporter, with them assuming, of course, that I had. And then I had to go and get that straightened out, so I actually did get the degree. And then that was it, and that was 1985, and I worked in newspapers until 2008.
And were you writing fiction at this time, or when did you start?
I had made a couple attempts at it, and then there's a lot of mystery readers here. So there was a writer named Mark McGarity who wrote a series of novels on the pen name Bartholomew Gill, set in Ireland.
Death of a Joyce Scholar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he worked at the Star Ledger as the nature writer, and I was introduced to him. And at that point, I was trying to write my first novel. It was like the late 90s. And somebody knew that I was working on a novel and said, "Oh, you got to meet Mark." Mark McGarry was his real name. And so he said, "Oh, yeah, you're working on it or whatever." And he said, "Show me." He said, "I'd like to see something." At this point, I had acquired an agent, but he was an elderly man. He was a famous agent, but he's very elderly, and he was ill at the time. So I gave the pages to Mark, and he read it very quickly, and he said to me, "If your agent doesn't come through, I think mine would be interested in this." And so the thing went on with my original agent. He retired, he sold his business, and I was just waiting for him to bail on it so that I could give it to Mark. And I gave it to Mark, and he gave it to his agent, and she called me. She said, "I love it. I want to represent you." And then she sold it like 3 months later. So that was my first attempt at a novel. And again, it was luck. Where I was, the people I knew. I had done a lot of author interviews for newspapers. I interviewed Stephen King a couple times. I interviewed James Lee Burke a couple times. I had interviewed Clive Barker, who was a great horror novelist, who's kind of disappeared. But so I'd done a lot of interviews, and I had done a series of them with an LA writer named Gerald Petovich, who had been a former Secret Service agent, Treasury agent, wrote To Live and Die in LA, which became a movie. And we'd gotten very friendly. We'd been in contact, and I was working at the Asbury Park Press, and I got this offer to go to the Star Ledger, which was a much bigger paper, with an editor's position, and I knew it was gonna kill my writing time because it was an hour commute each way, a totally new job, a lot more responsibilities. And I messaged him. I said, "Jerry, I don't know what to do. I feel like if I leave and take this other job, that I will not get this book written, and it'll just become the secondary thing in my life." And he said to me, "Take the job." He said, "It's going to greatly expand the circle of people that you know, and you will find a way to get the book done." And he was absolutely right, and that's absolutely what happened. I took the job on his advice. I took the job and met the guy who would end up taking my manuscript to his agent, who sold it.
Wow. So was working in newspapers, did that help you with discipline, being deadlines and making deadlines?
Yeah, I mean, you learn how to organize material, you learn how to write on deadline, you learn how to write, tight, and also, publishing editors tend to be very, aware of your feelings, very sensitive about your feelings, and not being too brusque or brutal. And in newspapers, nobody cared about your feelings. There was always another deadline and then coming, and that was the only thing that was important. And nobody cared about the way you felt about it, or whether your pride or your feelings were hurt. I mean, that was just, I was just used to people, screaming profanity in the newsroom, because that was the culture there. So, when I was dealing with my editors, I was just like, and they were saying, "Oh, do you worry? Do you mind doing this?" And I was just like, "Tell me what you want, give me a deadline, and I'll let you know if there's a problem." And that's it. So yeah, that aspect of newspapers really came in handy.
I know you're a big fan of pulp fiction and paperback originals and film noir and all those kind of things. Joe, what were some of your influences? I know you mentioned Sherlock Holmes and the Hood, but who are some of the writers that you look to for inspiration?
All the usual suspects. But I would say particularly Elmore Leonard. He's so sneaky good, you just carry along and you don't know how he does it, and he creates this amazing characters and he writes this amazing dialogue. He can write two pages of dialogue and tell you everything about who the guy is. You even know how he looks like, even though Elmore hasn't described him. I'm calling him Elmore like I knew him. He was my main influence. And Walter Mosley. Walter Mosley gave me permission to write about what I wrote about. He was sort of my example. He could write about pretty much my neighborhood, and there were people who read his books. It never occurred to me that I could write about my own growing up. I was never embarrassed about it, but I never thought it would be useful. So I would say those are the two main ones. Elmore Leonard and Walter Mosley.
And what about you, Wallace? I mentioned some of the classic noir stuff. Is that?
Yeah, well, I read all that stuff, and it's coincidence because I've been rereading a lot of Elmore Leonard recently. His early '80s books, especially, I love City Primeval and Split Images and Cat Chaser. And I've sort of been rereading those books to sort of reverse engineer them, to sort of figure out, how those things move along. Because a lot of those books are not driven by plot. There's a plot there, but they're kind of, laid back, but once you get into the rhythm of it, it's like you cannot put those books down. And a lot of it is the dialogue.
Yeah, two people
Yeah.
talking. You
Two
just get
people
right in
talking,
there
yeah.
telling a story.
Yeah.
He said that he comes up with the characters and then he lets them go. And if he created them well, then they would go to an interesting place. And he also said about dialogue that he said everybody talks, which means everybody is articulate in their own way, in their own vernacular. And like the thing I read with Dodson, you don't really hear street guys that articulate, these long run-on sentences and stuff. But what it does is it elevates the character. You know, Dodson is no longer a homeboy, he's this homeboy, he's this particular homeboy. And I stole a lot of stuff from More Letter.
And that's a sentiment that lots of people, guys especially, can relate to with the predicament that he's in. And Deronda is great in this book, man. She's got some really. Dodson sold his half of the food truck out, and then she makes him regret it. I don't want to give any spoilers.
Deronda is her own sort of force of nature. She was based on my first girlfriend, Stephanie Farrington, who lived 2 doors over.
Was she formidable?
I was 10, she was 11. She was a head and a half taller than me and outweighed me by 30 pounds. You know, my brother said that when we held hands, she looked like a ventriloquist with a Japanese I thought that was a little harsh.
It's a great image, though, isn't it?
But she, you know, everybody in the neighborhood was struggling. But Stephanie's family was destitute. She had a little brother and a little sister, and they were always running around crying, half naked. There was never any food in the house. Her mother was a drunk, and she walked around with this sawed-off piece of broomstick, and she just seemed to hit anybody who was close to her. For Christmas, Stephanie got nothing, 0. And she came out of that experience with the same attitude that I gave to Rhonda in the first book, IQ. You know, whatever I get in this life, I'm going to have to take it. And whatever it is, it's not enough. Because, you know, I used to share my lunches with Stephanie, okay, which is probably the most appealing thing about me. And she would complain about the sandwiches. Tell your mother I don't like mustard. And she was like that about everything. And I think it's because nothing would ever make up for the deprivation in her life. There was nothing that would ever fill that well of needs that were never met. And because I knew Stephanie, I could write around her.
And sometimes finding that key, finding that single key can open up the character for you and get into it in a way you would not have thought about it previously. In the editing process, with working with our editor, Josh, I had originally had Devlin's character have witnessed some atrocities, and that he was dealing with what he had seen. And then when I was having conversations with Josh while rewriting the book, he said to me, no, he didn't witness them, he took part in them inadvertently. And I thought, yes, that's it. Because now all of a sudden that gives him a lot of motivation, and it adds another layer to his character. And there's ways you can do that because you can imagine that situation actually happening. And I thought, well, yeah, that's the key. And once I knew that, once he told me that, and I thought about that, that opened up the character for me. And I rewrote a lot based on that because I knew that guy now.
Just kind of locked it into focus for you.
Yeah, you know, he locked it into focus in a way that, you know, it was sort of what I was getting at, but he found that the way to get there, the best way to get there, you know, the quickest way to get there.
You know, it goes back to that empathy thing, which you're really good at. When I was in high school, I had a friend named Cheesy, and Cheesy had 50 pairs of shoes, all of which were stolen. He would go, first he'd go to the Goodwill, he'd buy a pair of shoes for $1. Then he'd go into a shoe store. He'd try on a pair he liked, and he'd be walking up and down like he was, thinking if they were right for him. And as soon as the clerk turned their head, he was gone, zoom. And you'd have to be Hussein Bolt to catch Cheesy in the crowd. Cheesy kept the shoes in his crappy little room, and he had them arranged around the perimeter of the room in neat little pairs. And they weren't arranged by function, they were arranged by color. So there was the whites and pastels and primary colors and designs that could be anything from a coat of arms to a unicorn. But those shoes, he would take forever to choose a pair of shoes to wear that day. He would stand there like this and look at every pair. Meanwhile, I'm in the hall going, hurry the hell up. But those shoes were precious to him. They were the only things of value he owned. And in a very real way, Cheesy was his shoes. And if you know that, you can write about Cheesy.
Now, is Cheesy a hedge fund manager now?
Cheesy, I don't know what happened to Cheesy, but he will appear. Him and his 50 pairs of shoes, he will appear.
Well, what's next for you guys? Can you give us a hint of what's to come, Joe?
Sure. IQ4 is being edited. We don't have a title yet. But the premise is this. The client is a young woman with multiple personalities. She has 5 different personalities, very distinct. She witnessed a murder, but the police think she did it. So Isaiah is hired to get her off. But what he finds out is that each personality only saw part of the incident. Each of them has a clue. And so he has to extract the clues from each one of them. And, they lie, they make stuff up, and they're all pretty nuts. And so he has to take all that, make his case. So, stay tuned.
Little Sybil.
Yeah, actually, the idea occurred to me. I was watching a rerun of Three Faces of Eve.
Oh.
Yeah.
How about you, Wallace? What you got? Okay.
I like to change up as much as possible to confuse people and stall my career. So,
Is there a Western coming out?
so I wrote my big, wide scale book with international involvement, and now I'm working on a very tightly compact, intimate crime novel with just a handful of basic characters and a situation, and just to see if that see how that plays out.
Jersey setting?
Starts in Jersey, yeah. I wrote my first 2 books about the Jersey Shore, where I grew up and where I live now. And then the Chrissa books, because she worked all over the country, those were all over the place. But I wanted to write about the shore again, especially the shore in winter, which is a very unique thing, because it goes from there are towns that go from 70,000 people to 7,000 people over the course of Labor Day weekend. So I wanted to write about that kind of what winter's like at the shore, which is very bleak. So that as a setting, I thought I wanted to go back to that and do that.
Now, the obvious question for both of you guys, before I open it up to you for questions, TV. I mean, both of your series, the Chrissa Stone books in particular, and the IQ books, of course, would make terrific cable TV shows if done right. I'm sure you've both sold the rights, or anything going on in those.
IQ sold for television. The production company and the producers, they've had a couple of, mind you, they bought the book in 2015. They got a couple of pilots written, which they don't like. They're having a 3rd pilot written, and the guy who's writing the pilot is a guy named Matt Carnahan, who was writer-producer of House of Lies. He's a formidable guy, and he can really write. So he's doing he's doing the next one. And he's a terrific guy. You know, studios and authors, after you sell a book, you're nothing. You know, you're just some guy. But Matt said that he told the studio, you know, he wanted total transparency, and he wanted Joe to be aboard. And you know, go to the meetings and stuff, which was a surprise. Screenwriter in Hollywood is, you know, is a fire hydrant. And so this is the first time as a writer I've ever had anybody invite me to a meeting. So it'll still be a while.
Did it occur to you at any point to want to try and do a version of the script yourself?
I was asked, but I'd had enough of screenwriting. You know, mostly because I know the process. It's pretty much done by committee, and everybody wants to get their 2 cents worth in, put their stamp on it, and sometimes they know what they're doing, and sometimes they don't. So I was just done with TV. I was done.
How about you and TV?
Well, Showtime optioned the Crissa books back in 2012, and Ted Talley, who won an Oscar for Silence of the Lambs, wrote a pilot, and so we were in. They developed it for a while. Again, I was involved in every stage. Ted was great about that. He would run things by me, and there were, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but there was some material he had to add that was not in the book, backstory, in order to make the pilot script work. And so he would send me these new things that he'd written, and most of the times they were okay. And he sent me one key scene that I thought was absolutely awful. I just thought it was terrible. I didn't think there was any way of saving it, and I was aghast at how bad it was. And so, I was going to respond to him, and I thought, well, what happens to our relationship is going to be set in stone by how I respond to this.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And so I have a friend who's a TV writer and producer who worked on Leverage and Felicity, and he's now on NCIS New Orleans. And he had been giving me advice on when I was going out there for pitching. I had all kinds of questions I'd never done before. What do I wear to the meetings? How involved do I get? And I messaged him and I said, listen, Ted Talley just sent me these pages and they're terrible. What should I do? He says, well, don't be a dick about it, but it's your work, and if you're not going to speak up, no one's going to speak up. And so I spent an entire day and a half writing this email to Ted, which began with, oh, that's an idea. That's a great idea if you think it'll work, but how about this? And then I came up with another option, for what the scene needed to do, but written in a whole different way, different setting and everything. And then I hit the send button. I thought, well, this is it. Whatever his response is that's going to decide what happens. And he messaged me back and said, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Wow.
And one of the things I learned, you asked what I learned in journalism that carried over into books, and there were 2 things that I learned in journalism school that if I forgot everything else that I learned in journalism school, which I might as well because all of it's irrelevant now, but the 2 things were better to beg forgiveness than ask permission, is the first one. And the second one was editors don't want your problems, they want your solutions. So never go to an editor with a problem unless you've already figured out the solution.
I'm going to remember that. Sure.
There's also pause when agitated.
Yeah, well, that's a given.
Before hitting send on that email.
Is that how that works?
Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you, it's a very good therapy to write emails that you don't send.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then you accidentally send one.
That's what you gotta be careful on, yeah.
Let's open it up to questions. Anybody have any questions for either of these guys? I was afraid of this. Jim.
Well, I'm
Jim Fain, right?
right.
Hi.
I've told you before, I'm a huge fan of the Wallace Stroby series. Is there any hope of seeing any more of those books?
I wrote a short story about her that's going to be in an anthology that Lawrence Block edited that's coming out beginning of next year called At Home in the Dark. So I had a short story, an idea, which I had started but had never finished. And then he asked me to contribute to this book. So that was an impetus to finish the story. And I wanted it to be, the whole thing to take place in 9 hours, and just to be her on the run for the whole time, and to do as little exposition as possible. So it was kind of an experiment. And every time I would go in and rewrite it, I would take more exposition out and try and fit stuff in there so you knew what was going on, but there didn't have to be a lot of description. And that's one of the reasons why I was sort of reverse engineering these Elmore Leonard books, is because you get the setting in your head, but you don't, he doesn't always say, we were sitting in Joe's Cafe having coffee from, mugs, but you kind of pick up the picture anyway. So I wanted to do something. It was also kind of inspired by the Carol Reed's film Odd Man Out with James Mason, which is about a Irish Republican Army guy who's wounded and has to survive one night while soldiers are out looking for him. So I wanted to have a story that was just momentum, with her in it. And she has some money, and there's some Dominican guys searching for her in East New York, is that area, Brooklyn. Pretty dangerous area. And the whole idea was she has to survive the night and get back.
Sounds like fun. You guys haven't mentioned your short story of Patrick's.
Oh, right there.
Oh, so it
That was a real thrill. I put together this book, and the theme was cars driving on the road, really, or the road. And I asked bucket list of all my favorite writers. Some of them couldn't, and Wallace came up with just a killer story.
He didn't ask.
I don't think I knew you yet. when I was-
Sure you
It
did.
was a few years ago.
Yeah. Will you be in the next one?
Sure.
Yeah. No, but yeah, but great story. Kind of a Twilight Zone feel to it.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a good editing experience because again, you saw what I was going for, and you were trying to push me a little bit towards that. Because a lot of times, you kind of want to hold back, and that's not always good. You want it to be clear.
It was a fun project. Anybody else have any questions?
We were talking about empathy for characters, and we were talking a little bit about the contractor thing.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine's father, who I co-dedicated the book to, who passed away a couple of years ago, had been a special forces guy in Vietnam very early on, like 1963, before anybody really knew what was going on over there. And he had retired. He'd been in his career military, and he retired, and he was living in a trailer in Nevada, out in the desert. But he was keeping in contact with all these guys that were over in Iraq on these various bulletin boards that he subscribed to. And so he would get all this stuff from these guys. And then if he found something he thought was interesting, he would send it to me, because at that time I was doing some research along those lines. And it was full of these this sort of boots on the ground wisdom that you wouldn't normally get, but it was just guys that shared that. And one of them, one of the ones I always remember was, the phrase was, when the pin is out, Mr. Grenade is not your friend. And it went on to say how the thing they have to teach people is put your arm outside the vehicle before you pull the pin. Because if you get jostled, you don't want to drop the grenade at your feet. Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff, and he gave me lots of that stuff. It was great. So those kind of little details. And I was asking him about the psychological makeup of these guys. And he was telling me how the whole Rambo thing is a myth, because Special Forces is about teams. The whole thing is focused on teams. And that they weed these crazy guys out very quickly. And they have all ways of doing it. And one of them, he told me about this psychological test that they give them. And some of you may have heard this, and he told me one of the questions, and I'll throw it out there. This is trying to weed out sociopaths. And the question was, a woman's mother dies, and she's at the funeral, and across the room in the funeral home, she sees the most handsome man she has ever seen in her life. And he looks at her, they make eye contact from across the room, and he smiles at her, and then he leaves. So she starts asking everybody in the funeral home, does anybody know who this guy was? Anybody know his name? And nobody knows anything about him. She runs outside and he's gone. So she has no clue. The next week, she wakes up that morning and she kills her sister. Why? There is no real answer. But what your answer is depends on depends on where you come from psychologically. So what was the reason she killed her sister?
If he's at one funeral, he might be at another.
Absolutely. That she hopes he'll come to the funeral. Because that's the way a sociopath thinks, that it's all about me and what I want. And everything else is collateral damage.
You gotta look out for this guy.
Scotty.
I thought it was obvious, but I'm sorry.
Well, hey, final question for both of you guys. Chandler or Hammett?
Hammett.
Okay.
I mean, that was reading Hammett early on was, that was a world that I recognized. That was those people, dealt with real world issues. Chandler was a beautiful writer, but I never felt that connection to him. Especially Hammett's book, The Glass Key, which I think is his greatest book. I think it's better than Maltese Falcon because it's about friendships, it's about class, it's about when a woman comes between two men who have been lifelong friends, and those are real world situations. With a mystery plot book, but those are people that you recognize.
I can't make that choice.
Both?
Yeah, both. I can't make that choice.
They're lumped in together, but I think they're two very, very different writers.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks everybody for coming out
Yes,
tonight,
thank
and let's
you.
give them a nice round of applause. If you would be so kind as to just fold up your chair and place it against the closest wall, we would really appreciate it. You line up my number.